Ever wondered why a man who was kicked out by multiple countries, denied citizenships, a total failure, and one who died in extreme poverty to the extent that his wife had to pawn his pants to arrange for meals, who should have been the face of failure, but still is hailed by many as a great man and an expert economist? Things don't add up, right? Now, if I tell you the man we are talking about is Karl Marx, many of you would want me kicked out of your country. But hold your horses. But if Karl Marx was such a big failure, why has he been romanticized by many as an expert on economics? To understand this difference between the two realities, we need to dive deep into the story of Dear Carly. So brace for impact, because it's definitely not what you think. Karl Marx was born on May 5, 1818, in Trier, a historic city situated along the winding Moselle River in the western borderlands of the Kingdom of Prussia. Trier was a city defined by historical layering. It was an ancient Roman provincial capital that had spent decades under French Revolutionary and Napoleonic administration before being handed over to the conservative Prussian monarchy by the Congress of Vienna in 1815. Marx did not merely grow up in a comfortable family, he was born into the absolute upper crust of Rhenish patrician society. His family home in Trier was a multi-story, grand Baroque property located a short walk from the Porta Nigra, a prime piece of real estate in a city dominated by rigid class hierarchies. Marx's father, Heinrich Marx, was a high-ranking justice rat, meaning a Supreme Court counselor. He was one of the most powerful legal minds in the province, effectively controlling the contracts, property disputes, and commercial fortunes of the Rhineland's rising industrial elite. The family owned profitable vineyards in the Moselle Valley, employed a large staff of domestic servants, and maintained a social circle consisting exclusively of high-ranking state officials, wealthy merchants, and Prussian nobility. Karl grew up with the distinct privilege of a child who knew that his father's signature could alter the financial fates of local citizens. From his earliest years, Karl exhibited the classic traits of an indulged, arrogant child of immense privilege. He was highly aware of his family's elevated social status and used it to dominate everyone around him. In the sprawling, private gardens of the Marx estate and the surrounding vineyards, young Karl ruled over his siblings and local children with an authoritarian streak. Marx routinely forced his sisters, Louise and Emily, and the children of the family's servants to bake complex mud cakes for his amusement. He would command these children to act as his horses, forcing them to haul him at high speeds down the steep, rocky slopes of the family's vineyards, treating them as literal beasts of burden. If any child dared to rebel against his games, Karl used his sharp intellect to craft venomous, mocking poems and insults that humiliated them into submission. Because of his family's immense power, the neighborhood children rarely dared to complain to their parents. His mother, Henriette, indulged his temper tantrums, frequently giving him extra pocket money and treats to quiet his outbursts. This systemic spoiling created a young man who grew up believing that his comfort was a natural law, his intellect was absolute, and other people existed primarily to execute his will. Marx's sense of entitlement only amplified as he grew into his teenage years. He successfully courted Jenny von Westphalen, a woman from a line of high-ranking Prussian privy councillors and British aristocrats. Securing the Queen of Trier was a massive status symbol. It solidified Marx's position within the ruling class before he had achieved anything of his own accord. When Marx went to the University of Bonn in 1835, his behavior mutated into that of a classic, reckless, aristocratic playboy. Backed by his father's substantial bank account, Marx did not spend his time in the libraries. Instead, he lived the lavish, destructive life of an elite heir. Marx stopped attending lectures. He stopped washing. His room became a drift of tobacco ash, spilled ink, and half-chewed crusts of bread. He was arrested by the university police for riotous behavior, disturbing the peace, and public drunkenness. When his father wrote him furious letters demanding an account of his massive expenditures, Karl simply ignored them. knowing that his family would always bail him out to avoid a public scandal. Even when transferred to the more rigorous University of Berlin, Karl refused to conform to middle-class discipline. He lived in luxury apartments, bought expensive books he never read, and spent nights drinking champagne while debating philosophy. He treated his family not as a source of moral guidance, but as a bottomless cash reserve designed to fund his chaotic whims. Following the death of Heinrich Marx in May 1838, Henriette became the sole executor of the substantial family estate. Under Rhenish law, the children were entitled to a portion of their inheritance, but Henriette legally held the capital to secure her own livelihood. Marx, still drifting through the University of Berlin as an over-budget student, demanded his cash payout immediately. Despite doing zero formal work, Marx was spending roughly $700 to $800 a year. To put this in perspective, a high-ranking Prussian state official earned approximately $800 annually, while a working-class family survived on fewer than $200. Marx repeatedly forced his mother to send cash advances against his future inheritance to pay off local tailors, book merchants, and high-end tavern debts in Berlin. When Henriette sent him letters demanding receipts and an itemized budget, Marx openly mocked her domestic frugality in letters to his friends, referring to her financial caution as narrow-minded petty bourgeois provincialism. The financial breakdown between Karl Marx and his mother, Henriette Pressburg Marx, was a direct consequence of his refusal to curb his lavish, entitled spending habits after his father's death in 1838. Raised in the absolute luxury of the Trier patrician class, Marx viewed his family's wealth as a personal credit line. When Henriette attempted to enforce basic financial accountability, Marx reacted with aristocratic outrage, triggering a bitter, multi-decade legal and personal war. The flashpoint occurred in 1841, when Marx finally received his elite education to secure a lucrative professorship or a high-paying legal registry to support his family. He abandoned all professional ambitions to focus entirely on radical anti-state journalism and political activism. Henriette realized that her son had no intention of ever becoming financially self-sufficient. She made a calculated, executive decision to protect the family asset pool from his reckless spending. When Marx announced his impending marriage to the aristocratic Jenny von Westphalen in 1843, Henriette flatly refused to fund the wedding or provide a domestic stipend. She declared that she would not throw good money after a son who actively insulted the Prussian state that protected their property. Marx responded to his mother's financial freeze not with humility, but with a series of hostile legal maneuvers. He hired attorneys to systematically audit his mother's management of the family estate, accusing her of deliberately withholding his rightful property. The legal assault was not merely a dispute over ledger sheets. It was an act of psychological warfare against a woman who had already lost her husband and was struggling to keep the family's social standing intact. Karl, from his distant lodgings, penned letters that were chilling in their arrogance. He did not ask for money. He demanded it with the cold, detached logic of a man who viewed his own mother as an obstacle to his intellectual destiny. He spoke of rights, legal claims, and mismanagement, twisting the law to frame his mother's attempts at financial prudence as a personal betrayal. For Henriette, the situation was humiliating. Her son, whom she had shielded from the consequences of his own indolence for years, was now turning the weapons of the state, the very state he claimed to despise, against her. He effectively held the family's dignity hostage. If she did not provide the funds, he threatened public scandal. If she did, he consumed it on his lavish tastes, tavern bills, and the high society lifestyle he maintained while courting Jenny von Westphalen. The emotional toll was immense. Henriette saw not a revolutionary in the making, but a son who had become a stranger, a man consumed by a toxic sense of entitlement that blinded him to the suffering of those who loved him. She was forced to choose between the preservation of her family's limited future and the demands of a child who refused to grow up. Karl, meanwhile, remained utterly devoid of empathy. He saw his mother's resistance as proof of her narrow-minded, petty bourgeois limitations. In his view, his theoretical work, the writing he prioritized over any honest form of employment, justified his actions. He was the genius. She was the gatekeeper. And to Karl Marx, gatekeepers existed only to be forced open. This cycle of financial extortion and emotional manipulation would define his relationship with his family for years to come, a testament to a man who, while preaching the liberation of the masses, remained perpetually imprisoned by his own colossal ego. If Trier was the nursery of Marx's entitlement, Europe became the stage for his unending, self-imposed ruin. Having successfully bled his mother dry and burned every bridge in his native Prussia, Marx found that the real world had very little patience for an arrogant, unproductive intellectual who expected the universe to subsidize his tavern-hopping lifestyle. His transition into a professional revolutionary was, in reality, a desperate flight from the consequences of his own incompetence. In 1845, Marx was expelled from Paris at the request of the Prussian government. Why? Because the French authorities had finally tired of his radical posturing, which was less about changing the world and more about creating loud, disruptive spectacles that made him impossible to ignore. Marx left Paris not as a martyr for a cause, but as an unwanted guest whose presence was an administrative headache. He arrived in Brussels, already a man of toxic reputation, and immediately set about turning his new surroundings into a private fiefdom of debt. He didn't seek work, he sought patrons. He treated the local radical circles as captive audiences, demanding that they fund his expensive tastes while he spent his days in drafty cafes scribbling dense, unreadable prose that he believed would define the future of humanity. When the Belgian authorities eventually grew weary of his erratic behavior and his tendency to organize agitation that resulted in nothing but police intervention, they too showed him the door. Marx was a man who moved through borders like a wrecking ball through a china shop. In every city, Paris, Brussels, London, he played the same game. He would arrive with a sense of haughty superiority, charm the local intellectuals until they recognized his corrosive personality, and then begin the cycle of borrowing, squandering, and insulting everyone who helped him. He was kicked from country to country because he was fundamentally unmanageable. He was not a worker, he was a drain. He was not a leader, he was a professional moocher who viewed his fellow activists as bottomless piggy banks for his own domestic survival. He was the classic spoiled brat of the 19th century, incapable of holding a job, refusing to support his own children, and perpetually surprised that the world didn't view his utter lack of personal responsibility as a grand revolutionary virtue. London, the industrial heart of the world, became the final, brutal terminus for Marx's grand delusions. He arrived in 1849, believing himself a giant of thought, only to find that London didn't care about his pedigree, his arrogance, or his theoretical manifestos. Here, the consequences of his lifestyle finally caught up to him. He settled into the slums of Soho, not out of solidarity with the working class, but because it was the only place his diminishing funds, often pilfered from his wife Jenny's family or his only friend Engels, could afford. His life in London was a grotesque farce of misery, self-inflicted and entirely avoidable. While he sat in the British Museum reading room, crafting theories about the exploitation of the proletariat, his own household was a disaster of his own making. He refused to look for employment, viewing manual or administrative work as beneath his station, even as his children fell ill and his family went days without a decent meal. He was, in the most literal sense, a failure. He lived in filth, surrounded by pawn tickets for his belongings, including his own clothes. There is a perverse irony in the man who claimed to diagnose the ills of the global economy being unable to feed his own children. He was an entitled narcissist who felt the world was fundamentally broken because it refused to recognize his personal greatness. He spent his days lashing out at critics, writing vitriolic letters to anyone who questioned him, and demanding more money from Engels with the cold, ungrateful tone of a landlord collecting rent. His wife, Jenny, was the true victim of his arrogance, forced to endure the humiliation of pawning his trousers so they could have enough to eat, while Karl remained unbothered, convinced that his intellectual legacy was worth the starvation of his own family. He was never the hero of his own story. He was a man-child who lived his entire life at the expense of others. He died a social and financial pariah, leaving behind a legacy that has been romanticized by those who ignore the ugly truth that Karl Marx was, from his childhood in Trier to his lonely, bitter end in London, a profoundly spoiled, arrogant, and parasitical brat who never once understood the value of the bread he ate or the cost of the love he exploited. Marx's Das Kapital is often heralded as a rigorous scientific analysis of economics, yet when viewed through the lens of his own life, it appears more as a grand, ironic fable. The irony is staggering. Here was a man who had never spent a single day in a factory, never managed a ledger in a business, and who had spent his entire adult life being financially supported by the charity of others, setting himself up as the ultimate authority on the mechanics of production, labor, and capital. His theory was built in the isolated, dusty quiet of the British Museum reading room, far removed from the actual grime, noise, and complex realities of the Industrial Revolution he claimed to diagnose. While he wrote about the exploitation of the worker, he was busy exploiting the patience of his friend Friedrich Engels, who worked in the very capitalist textile mills that Marx so vehemently condemned. Marx lived off the surplus value generated by those mills, the very mechanism he argued was the root of all evil, to fund his intellectual pursuit of destroying the system that fed him. His economic science ignored the fundamental necessity of individual agency, incentive, and the messy, unpredictable nature of human behavior. He framed complex market interactions as a sterile, binary conflict between two abstract classes, conveniently ignoring the reality that capital is not merely a hoard of stolen value, but a tool for innovation and growth. His work was not a blueprint for a functioning economy, but a dense, obsessive critique designed to justify his own failure to find a place within the modern world. The lasting flaw of Das Kapital is that it reflects the author's own distorted worldview, one where success is inherently immoral and where the refusal to contribute to the economic system is framed as a form of intellectual heroism. Marx was not analyzing the economy. He was projecting his own personal resentment onto the world. He viewed the capitalist as a caricature of the oppressor, perhaps because he felt his mother, who tried to hold him to account, was the ultimate oppressor of his own perceived genius. By creating a theory that stripped the individual of responsibility and replaced it with a grand, deterministic narrative of class struggle, Marx provided a convenient shield for those who, like himself, felt entitled to the rewards of society without having to earn them. He transformed the feeling of personal inadequacy into a cosmic battle between good and evil. Ultimately, Das Kapital is a testament to the dangers of separating theory from reality. It is a work of immense ambition, but it lacks the humility of someone who has actually built something, traded something, or created value. Marx did not want to fix the economy. He wanted to rewrite the rules of reality so that he, the perennial dependent, could finally be declared the winner. He succeeded in becoming a historical icon, but at the cost of ignoring the simple human truth that a society functions on the collective effort of its citizens, not on the resentful scribblings of a man who viewed his family as a parasite, his friends as a bank, and the world as a stage for his own self-important tragedy. The grand theorist of poverty had a peculiar relationship with the reality of it. He lived in it, yet he was utterly incapable of navigating it. Marx's life in London was a masterclass in self-inflicted misery. He did not live in poverty because of an oppressive system. He lived in poverty because he refused to work, refused to manage money, and possessed an ego that deemed any honest labor beneath his dignity. He resided in a cramped apartment in Soho, surrounded by his terrified, destitute wife Jenny and their children. While he spent his days in the comfort of the British Museum reading room, his family suffered in a reality he helped create but refused to face. Their life was defined by the relentless, humiliating hunt for credit, pawned goods, and the constant threat of eviction. The most biting image of his supposed genius is the recurring necessity of Jenny Marx pawning Karl's only trousers. It was a visceral, degrading truth. The man who wrote the definitive text on the movement of capital could not keep his own clothes on his body. When he lacked the money to buy bread or milk, he did not reach for a trade. He reached for Friedrich Engels, his long-suffering benefactor, treating him not as a friend, but as an endless resource. Marx was, by every metric of the time, a professional failure. He failed to hold a job, failed to provide for his family, and failed to integrate into any society that offered him refuge. He viewed his own family's starvation as a peripheral annoyance to his work, a sacrifice he was more than happy to have them make. He lived as a parasite, writing manifestos against the very structure of commerce while relying on the scraps that commerce provided to keep him breathing. In the end, he was a man without a country, stateless, rejected by his native Prussia, and ignored by the very society he sought to overturn. In a cramped, dimly lit room in London, he sat alone, surrounded by stacks of uncompleted manuscripts and unpaid bills. Having outlived his wife, he sat as a failed man, clinging to the vanity of his theories while his physical world disintegrated. He possessed nothing, no property, no influence, and no legacy other than the ink stains on his fingers and a mountain of correspondence begging for handouts. His death was not the grand, revolutionary climax he imagined. It was a quiet, lonely fading away. He died as a political pariah, buried in a corner of Highgate Cemetery, his funeral attended by only a handful of people. He left behind a world that continued to function, thrive, and innovate in ways his deterministic mind claimed were impossible. He died not as a titan of industry or a leader of nations, but as a man who had exhausted the charity of every person who ever cared for him. He was a man who lived by the pen, but ultimately, the ledger of his own life proved him a total, unmitigated failure, leaving his children with nothing but poverty as their inheritance. The flawed and incorrect theories of Karl Marx are used by leftists to misguide the youth. They teach them to hate hard work and patronize them to become useless and frustrated. Now, we all know how such people end up in life, thanks to Marx personifying such a failed lifestyle and mindset. But why do leftists and anti-progressive elements romanticize a failure like Karl Marx? The answer is simple. Leftists are useless and unproductive themselves. They are parasites who thrive on the state funds and grants from the rich. Whatever is given to them out of pity is often mistook as entitlement for their uselessness. They devise unfruitful activities to justify their money-making schemes and to target the uninformed youth and give them a sense of purpose, mostly against an establishment, whether the government or corporate entities, who give grants to educate them, feed them, or patronize their stupidities. They are often on the lookout to systemically target educational institutions and take them over in order to make a larger group of leftists who become anti-establishment. Totally useless individuals, but in significant numbers form a noticeable group. Now, since they are totally useless, they cannot sustain their lifestyles through honest hard work. But as a herd of disruptive people, they are up for hire by other governments and businesses who want to disrupt or damage the image of other governments and businesses. If you enjoyed watching this video, please leave a like and hit the subscribe button for more such videos. Let us know in the comments about your views or what you want to watch in future. Thanks for watching.